to rent or buy, a 30-year perspective. This is going to be excitement. I love this. This is from the Journal for Financial Planning, a group through the Financial Planning Association I used to be affiliated with for many, many years, but seems like as most groups do, lobbying groups, they took a sharp turn to the left, and so I dropped them like a hot potato for sure, but I still like some of their writing, just as a... I don't know why a financial planning organization would need to be overly involved politically, but you start supporting Marxism and things like liberation theology, I can't have anything to do with you. So just leave that as it is. It's nuts to me, but it's actually quite depressing in a way. Not depressing, disappointing. But this is a good one. So this is from their May 2018. I have a stack of JFP's, Journal for Financial Planning, is that thick back there. And when I have some time, I grab out the magazines. I look through them. Again, no longer being a member, I no longer get them. So we'll have to see where I get my research from now. All right, but this is from 2 PhDs or the University of Northern Iowa. So let's go through this. You'll get a lot out of this, I'm telling you, because I find this absolutely, this is probably the best study I've ever read on this. All right, so executive summary. Past studies have suggested that home ownership is superior to renting, and a number of rent versus buy calculators exist, many of which support this finding, as do realtors. Shh. I know I got realtors on here, but you know what I'm talking about, my friends. These calculators, however, often do not incorporate all the expenses involved with either home ownership or renting, and many assume a short time horizon, despite the fact that many families maintain households for decades. This paper presents long-term historical scenarios for 6 metropolitan areas that compare accumulated ending wealth for the rent versus buy decision. The scenarios incorporate the major costs of home ownership and renting over a 30-year time horizon. These historical scenarios, which reflect year-to-year changes in such factors as mortgage rate and investment returns, show that home ownership has not always been the best decision for a family financially. I'll only pause just a second. Imagine a young family comes to you, their financial planner, with a question. Are we better off to buy or to rent? What would your answer be? Most financial planners would likely provide the answer that a lot of clients would expect, that is, better to buy. And we got lots of previous studies showing that. But we want to dive into it deeper with a little bit more detail. And the purpose of this study is to provide background for the decision by analyzing whether families in 6 different metropolitan areas would have been better off financially had they rented or owned over the 30-year period between 1984 and 2013. This study showed that the consequences of this decision are not always in favor of home ownership. In fact, you'll be pretty surprised what we find out at the end, which I'll share with you here in just a second. This historical data presented suggests that the home ownership decision should not be uniformly adopted. That's, at the end of the day, that's exactly 100% right. It should not be uniformly adopted. All right. And he talked about some of the reasons why home ownership is better and uncertainty of rent and all that. They talk about property taxes, some of the benefits of home ownership, some of the negatives of home ownership, and all that stuff too. So we're going to skip all that. All right, but I want to go to the data and methodology. The study used historical financial data from 1984 through 2013 to examine the rent versus buy decisions for Kansas City, San Francisco, Chicago, Miami, Minneapolis, and Stanford. Stanford is right outside New York, by the way. Rent illustrations were based on the applicable rent index from the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics. Owned home values were adjusted for each market using the applicable Freddie Mac House Price Index. Therefore, the expenses of renting and owning and house values mirror the increases and decreases that occurred in each market. So let me show you table 1 here. And as you can see, we got Kansas City, San Francisco, Chicago, Miami, Minneapolis, and Stanford. The rent here is pretty interesting. So the rent in Kansas City is $7,500. San Francisco is $13,000. But look at the home value. The home value in Kansas City to the rent is about 10%. So you're paying 10% of the rent to the home value in Kansas City. And San Francisco is less. It's about 8% of the home value to the rent in San Francisco. All right, so keep that in mind. It's a big deal. Chicago is less. No, Chicago's, let's see. Actually, what is Chicago? Excuse me. Let me see that. So it's for Chicago, you're paying $66.24. Divide that by 76,547. You're paying 8.6 in Chicago is from the rent to home value. So Chicago is less than 10%. San Francisco is just slightly less than 10%. Miami is a little bit more than 10%. Minneapolis is right at 10%. Stanford is significantly 11 divided by 175. 11 divided by 175 is only 6.2%. Does that make sense? So in Miami, Chicago, basically San Francisco, and Kansas City, you're basically paying 10% of the amount for rent as a home is valued. In Chicago and Stanford, you're paying significantly less. Chicago's 8.6, Stanford is 6.2. So it only costs 6.2% to rent relative to the home value. I hope that makes sense. If you look at it a different way, that means the home values in Stanford and Chicago were much, much more expensive relative to renting. That's kind of where you look at the inverse of that. I talk about property tax, the whole thing, mortgage information, the interest rates, closing costs, and all that. All right, so this analysis compared rent versus buy decisions in these 6 metropolitan areas for 8 years, 10 years, 12, 16, 24, and 30, which is a contrast in previous studies, which only limited it to one time frame. So they're looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different time frames. The study also showed the net terminal wealth at the end of the annual periods, and a decision can be evaluated for any desired length of time with the ending wealth at the end of the given year. Let's see. Okay, so assumptions. It was assumed that the same amount of money was available for renting or owning. All right, so you got, let's just say Chicago. You got $10,000 a year to either own or rent, and it costs you $6,624 to rent, and we'll say it costs $10,000 to own. The remainder that you're using is going into a stock and bond portfolio, 50-50 stocks, if that makes sense, and conversely, the vice versa. If you live in a place that's cheaper, Kansas City, for say the home is cheaper than the rent, the amount that you're paying on your mortgage, which is less the amount you're paying on rent, is being reinvested in the market. So hope that makes sense. Whichever option was costlier in any given year was taken to be the total amount available for housing for that particular year. Therefore, the difference between the cost of renting and owning was available for investing in the capital markets and accrued towards the total ending wealth for the lower cost option. That's interesting. And again, we're using a 50-50 portfolio of stocks and bonds. I would have used at least a much more aggressive, but that's okay. That's what we're going to do here. For each of the 6 illustrations presented, it was assumed that the family either rented or owned, and the decision was not reversed. They talk about how really infrequently people do reverse the decision between renting and owning. And again, we got those 7 different time frames too, 8 years, 12 years, and whatnot. All right, so let's keep going down. They talk about the calculations. We're not going to get in that here. I'll put a link in the show notes for sure. All right, now the one thing I did want to point out was housing characteristics right here. Recognizing there was a wide variety of housing types in any given market, typical characteristics of owner-occupied and renter-occupied homes were considered to facilitate comparisons in decision-making. The average owner-occupied home in each of the 6 markets had 3 bedrooms, and the average rented home had 2, according to the American Housing Surveys from the Census Bureau. Those surveys also showed that the median square home of owned homes was 1,600 feet in New York, 2,000 in Minneapolis, for an average of 1,800 square foot. The median rental square footage, they do the median, they use the average for the home, the median, not the average, okay. The median rental square footage ranged from 750 in New York to 1,450 in San Francisco, with the average of the 6, okay, they're using the average of the 6, I got you. The median then of each individual market, then the average of the 6 markets was 1,028 square feet. So they're basically saying, look, a 3-bedroom home and the average of the 6 metropolitan areas had 40% more square footage than a 3-bedroom rental apartment in those 6 areas. So what they're going to do instead is they're going to use 4 bedrooms on the rent to compensate for the difference in square footage. I actually think that's a mistake. I don't think that's a good idea. There can be less supply for 4-bedroom rentals. They'll be certainly more expensive. And if you need a 3-bedroom home, you're not going to need a 4-bedroom rental necessarily. I think that was a mistake. I would not have done that. I think that overprices the rent actually, and underprices, or actually I should say overprice the rent. So that would make the home ownership end result to look more attractive, in my opinion. All right, so they're using the annual rent was the median annual rent for and there we go, for a 4-bedroom apartment as talked about by HUD, Housing and Urban Development. And then they're using the Freddie Mac House Price Index. So they use that mortgage expenses, principal and interest are based on an 80% loan to value, 30-year fixed conventional mortgage as reported by Freddie Mac in each of the applicable years. They're assuming that homeowners refinance when rates fall as well, 13.37 in 1984, 6.79 all the way down to 1999 and between. All right, you talk about utilities, the whole thing. So let's go down to the results. All right, so what is interesting here, they're going to give us two different result times. They're going to say if you're in the 15% tax bracket or if you're in the 30% tax bracket. And what you'll see here is in red with the parentheses meant that home ownership was much more valuable than renting. So we have 6 and 6. We got 36 different time frames, scenarios for 8, 12, 10, 12, 30, 24, and 16 years. So we got 16, so 8 to 30 years, different time frames. Each city with 6 different times. So basically, there's 6 cities, each had 6 different year time frames. And so we have 36 time frames, 36 unique surveys. And in a 15% tax bracket, 24 times, or 2/3, it came out better to have rented in those 36 times. So that's nuts. The exception was San Francisco. Every single time it was better to own in San Francisco, and that is literally attributed to nothing more than the low cost of the home in San Francisco in 1984. The rents were only 6.8% to the cost of the home. The rents in San Francisco were higher than the cost of the home in San Francisco relative to the average in the U.S. In Stanford, the rents were only 6.8% as opposed to the cost of the home in Stamford, Connecticut, which means the homes in Stanford were much more expensive, relatively speaking, than the homes in San Francisco. Just like the stock market, valuations determine everything. So whereas San Francisco, every single 6 of the 6 years, it was better to own, and Stanford, every single of the 6 years time frames is better to rent. In fact, if you owned in San Francisco, you would have made out like a bandit, $1.4 million ahead in overall net worth. If you owned in Stanford, you would have been to the less by $462,000. Now, if you go to 28% tax bracket, home ownership was better 2/3 of the time. Again, San Francisco, every single time was better to be a homeowner. Kansas City, every single time. Minneapolis, every single time. And Stanford, it was better to be a homeowner even, even 2 of the 4 times. So just the tax benefits of mortgage interest deduction really favored the home ownership if you're into a higher tax bracket for sure. But even then, 12 times out of 36, or 33% of the time, you would have been better off renting versus owning. And at the end of 30 years in both Chicago and Stanford, you would have been better off renting. Not a huge amount, but to the benefit of about $111,000 in Chicago and $76,000 in Stanford. Again, the issue comes down to, at the end of the day, and here's a nice graph that shows you the outlier that San Francisco was. The issue just literally comes down to the price, the value of the house when they started this study in 1984. Just like buying a stock, you buy the lower price stocks, the low value stocks, the riskier stocks, you're more likely to make out like a bandit. If I may, my friends, you also have to look at the surrounding areas too. So New York City back then was crime infested. People wanted to get out of Dodge. Read the book, The Bonfires of the Vanities, to get a gauge of how New York was back then. And so people were going to Stanford to escape the chaos that was New York City, Manhattan particularly. And Stanford was a wonderful bedroom community, safe, quiet, and expensive. But if you had the bucks, you moved there. San Francisco in 1984 and so the mean streets of New York were driving people to Stanford, and that meant Stanford prices were higher. Conversely, AIDS was running rampant in the gay community in San Francisco. Gays had not were still discriminated against horribly back then in 1984. San Francisco was the only place of a reprieve from that. So unless you were gay, you just weren't buying in San Francisco. You're worried about AIDS. The gays hadn't quite made headway as they have now. And so because of that, people stayed away. They moved to a place like Los Altos and Walnut Creek and whatnot, which would be similar to Stamford, Connecticut today. what was similar to Stamford, Connecticut back then. So they should have done a comparison of Walnut Creek, for instance, to Stamford. I bet they would have found the same, that both of those places, it would have been better to buy in San Francisco and New York and rent in Walnut Creek and Stamford. I bet that would have been their conclusion. But this is how it works. At the end of the day, it's just a matter of valuations. And so I think the nice round number here, if you're kind of looking at this, is to say to yourself, if I can get a rental less than 10% of the property of the home, all right, so I'm paying $5,000 a year for rent, and the house is worth $100,000, excuse me, that is a good indication that the home is overpriced relative to rents. If I'm paying $15,000 a year for rental, that's a good indication that the home is undervalued relative to rents. That should be a nice rule of thumb to look at it. If I'm paying 10% or more, that would tell me that the rentals are more expensive than homes. If I'm paying 10% or less, that tell me that homes are more expensive than rentals. So anyway, I think that's a pretty interesting piece. I'll put a link in the show notes. Like I said, big fan of the Journal for Financial Planning. Not a big fan of the left turn that they're taking now, but this is good stuff. So again, if you like what you see here, smash, subscribe, share, say, comment down below. Was this surprising to you? Yeah, just say yes, you're surprised by this analysis, or no, you were not. Your comments, even as simple as a yes or no, helps me immensely. So we'll see you next time. Thanks now.